I have that bittersweet feeling that comes in life. I'm dying to leave, but I hate to go.
5 weeks after the signing of the Stormont Agreement, Castle Buildings still echoes to the sounds of an historic deal. The agreement was brokered by Senator George Mitchell, who was first sent here 3 years ago as President Clinton's special envoy. Now back in the United States, he recalls the day he gave our politicians an ultimatum.
I said words to this effect: we will stay in session until we either get an agreement or we fail to get an agreement, and in either event, we will all go out and explain to the waiting press and through them the world why we succeeded or why we failed.
Stephen, anything new in the last 20 minutes?
Well, this is it. This is the agreement.
You have it in your hand.
I have it in my hand. 67 pages.
It's grown by 2.
Yes. The BBC was first to get hold of a copy of the Stormont deal, leaked to me 4 hours before the parties agreed it. On that cold Good Friday afternoon, 2 years of wrangling, backbiting and negotiation finally delivered. The last 4 days of those talks were a nerve-jangling, white-knuckle ride for all concerned. This is the story of what really happened here inside George Mitchell's office and in the rest of Castle Buildings. It was a political pressure cooker that several times threatened to blow up in the senator's face. In the late afternoon of April the 4th, Senator George Mitchell, chairman of the Stormont talks, was hard at work in his office, putting the finishing touches to his eagerly awaited draft agreement.
We were ready to go with that paper on Friday evening. And then I got a telephone call from Prime Minister Blair and Prime Minister Ahern. It was a joint call. It was about 6:30 on Friday evening. They told me that they were in London. They were negotiating on Strand 2 on the North-South institutions. They hadn't completed their negotiations, and they asked me to defer, to delay putting forward my paper on Strand 2.
Senator Mitchell postponed publication as the two governments haggled, the Irish representing nationalist concerns and unionists hoping the British would do the same for them.
It was a real depressing weekend because we had scheduled meetings and nothing was going to happen. And we got very concerned because we wanted to have lots of consultation the following week, and we knew as we got closer to the deadline that wasn't going to happen, so it was putting people's stress levels up.
On Sunday evening, 2 days later, the governments completed their negotiations and reached an agreement on Strand 2. And they gave me that paper. And they gave it to me with the request that I submit it unchanged, that I make no change at all in the Strand 2 section. The governments were quite insistent on that, the Irish government more than the British, but both very anxious that there be no change in it. Now I confess to you that we had some discussion about it. It was a spirited discussion, and my colleagues and I had some concerns about it, about presenting a document as ours, which in effect was not ours.
Senator, will you have a paper? Senator, will you have a paper today?
But when Senator Mitchell arrived on Monday morning, April the 6th, the growing ranks of an increasingly sceptical media were speculating on the reasons for the delayed presentation of his document. Inside Castle Buildings, delegates were growing restless.
What had become increasingly apparent over those previous few days was that Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern were to a very great extent not only participating but beginning to steer the whole process themselves, and yet they weren't on site.
Senator Mitchell and his colleagues finally released the document late on Monday evening.
We submitted a paper that included provisions that we had worked on all of the other sections, and we'd taken drafts from the governments, suggestions from the parties, and put them in the final paper, and included a Strand 2 section that was untouched.
The party leaders were warned about the consequences of leaking the document.
Lives and deaths are at stake here. And it will be incredible to me if anyone involved in this process feels that they can somehow gain an advantage by engaging in that kind of action.
That the document wasn't leaked was an encouraging sign, but within minutes of picking up their copies, the Unionists were rejecting it.
That night when we got the draft, I quickly went through it, went to the Strand 2 section, went to where the points that I'd been discussing with the Prime Minister Monday morning, Saturday, looked for them. They weren't there. They weren't there. And what was there was a set of proposals that would bypass the Assembly. And what was also there at the end were these huge long lists, Annexes A, B and C, 40 things, I think, in Annex A, 16 in B, 8 in C, for cross-border schemes and bodies and whatnot and all the rest of it. The pudding had been over-egged quite considerably. And the minute we saw that, we said, we've got a problem.
I can understand the Unionist reaction in one way, seeing it all together, especially with the section on prisoners, decommissioning, policing, equality, all of those.
I knew that this document was not saleable. It wasn't going to run. Not because, as a whole, it was massively flawed, but there were a number of significant areas where the accent in it, the nuance that someone like George Mitchell would have been very clear about, was wrong. It wasn't something that, if presented to the people of Northern Ireland, could go.
This paper is unacceptable to the Ulster Unionists. I personally could not be identified with it. It creates many difficulties, and they have to be overcome.
Is this document a dead letter as far as you're concerned?
I wouldn't touch it with a 40-foot pole.
On Sunday, I spoke to Mr. Blair on the telephone and told him he needed to come. Today, it's Tuesday, and if the Prime Minister wants a deal, he better get here fast.
Inside Castle Buildings, David Trimble had already been in touch with Downing Street.
We made it absolutely clear that there had to be a willingness to consider a fundamental change, and in the absence of that willingness, then we would prefer not to get involved in a negotiation and to say, well, that's it.
I'll always remember the sound of that helicopter coming in. One could almost feel at that stage that whatever had happened beforehand in these negotiations, that this really was endgame now.
I think that I certainly had a sense that this British Prime Minister was coming to do the business. Doesn't necessarily mean he was coming to do the type of business that I wanted done, or indeed even the type of business that David Trimble wanted done.
The Prime Minister set up temporary residence at Hillsborough Castle, and while staff prepared for an indefinite stay, he was quickly into his stride.
I feel the hand of history upon our shoulders in respect to this. I really do. And I just think we need to acknowledge that and respond to it. Now, maybe it's impossible to find a way through. Maybe even with the best faith in the world, you can't do it. But it's right to try.
He'd hardly unpacked before the deputations arrived.
He hadn't expected us for another 10 minutes, and when we walked in, he was simply wandering around the place on his own. So we weren't introduced by any of his aides or anyone. We just simply walked up and said, "Hi, Tony, what's going on here?" You know, and he laughed, took us inside, and we sat down, and within 2 minutes, he knew exactly how serious the situation was.
David Trimble's visit was rather different. He entered Hillsborough on his own and spent an hour and a half with the Prime Minister. On Wednesday morning, the Taoiseach, Bertie Ahern, had to leave the talks to attend his mother's funeral in Dublin. His decision to return to Belfast immediately afterwards demonstrated his commitment to the process and touched the hearts of all the delegates.
Well, I think we were all impressed with Bertie's commitment to it. In the circumstances, his mother dying suddenly, the funeral on that Wednesday, to still, continue working and to come up twice, that day to Belfast, an indication of a very real commitment to it.
I remember very clearly being with him between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning, and I don't think I've ever seen a person more tired. He was just worn out, but he was clearly determined to see this thing through.
That whole process became quite emotionally charged as the week went on. The anxiety that it would go to pieces, the sense of reassurance that Tony Blair was coming in quickly, that Bertie Ahern was making these profound sacrifices to be there and to be part of the process, to try his best to deal with how things were going on. And then it just became an emotional switchback from then on.
With the deadline looming, the parties were bluntly told they couldn't renegotiate the whole document, just the 4 or 5 things they found most difficult.
Civil servants individually had been attached to parties, and we discovered very quickly that there was one for us. And we captured him and kidnapped him and sat him in the room and kept him there for a number of hours. And he was excellent, in fact, in talking down certain parts of the document with us. And we would redraft with him.
I said to our own party people, I said, look, you win or lose in negotiations on the quality of your drafting. So that we paid great attention to that from the very beginning. And in terms of the Strand 1, which was the last element of the negotiations to be tied up, to be agreed, we had something in the region of 30, I think it's 32, drafts of our own paper.
The final document, which referred to cross-border institutions, was shredded a couple of times on the Friday afternoon because the word "and" had been inserted where it should have been "or," all Ireland or cross-border bodies, instead of all Ireland and cross-border bodies. And again, it was very important that they got that word right.
Cross-border bodies were a critical element of the deal. Nationalists wanted them set up by London and Dublin. Unionists said that was the Assembly's job. The compromise was that the Assembly would set them up, but it had to do it within 6 to 8 months, or the new Stormont would be scrapped.
The initial germ of the idea came from ourselves, but it was in the discussion with the Irish government that it developed. I remember when we were looking at it, Paddy Tehan saying, "Oh yes, you mean it's just like threading pearls onto a string. You know, when you're making a necklace, you put the pearls on time, but then they all come up together."
David Trimble had 3 meetings with the Irish, stretching into the early hours of Thursday morning. But both the Ulster Unionists and Alliance were then left waiting for further meetings that never happened.
When Sinn Féin heard that the Irish government were on the point of making an agreement with us on something that had moved so far away from Sinn Féin's demands that they started to cause problems.
You wouldn't have a meeting maybe as quickly as you usually did, and you wondered, were they trying to send some kind of message, and you start spinning around all sorts of wonderings about what was going on. And then after a while you began to discover they're having a meeting with themselves at the moment because they've been landed with something that's very, very difficult and they don't quite know how to deal with it.
We never in fact actually met the Irish government again to finalise that. It was done through Tony Blair.
When David Trimble left for his party executive meeting at tea time on Thursday, he didn't have much to report. His trusted lieutenant, Geoffrey Donaldson, was at that stage still running alongside his leader.
And he indicated to them where the main difficulties lay. He also indicated to them what he hoped to achieve in terms of rectifying those difficulties. And he dealt, for example, with issues like decommissioning. And he made it clear at that stage that as far as we were concerned, decommissioning was an indispensable part of the process and had to be an indispensable part of any agreement.
So far, so good. But a deal was still a long way off, and he was about to enter a key phase of negotiations on the issue of how to share power with nationalists. There had already been a string of meetings with the SDLP. Now it was time to sign off on a Northern Ireland Assembly.
There had to be a centre of gravity. And the centre of gravity had to be the SDLP and the Ulster Unionist Party. Otherwise it wasn't going to work.
The first meeting, which lasted about an hour, was an appallingly bad meeting. You could feel the tension in the air. You had... it almost got to the stage where I said to myself for the first time, I said, look, God, this is going to blow. Now, I realised later that there were certain tensions within the unionist grouping and that even some of the things that they had previously agreed with us were not being readily accepted by them at that meeting. As it went on, we realised there were tensions there, so we suggested, look, we'll break.
There was then the first hint that Jeffrey Donaldson was not fully on board.
When they arrived back, there were 3 of them. There had been 4 at the previous meeting. And the atmosphere was absolutely, completely different. We got into the business, we went through our final draft, and we got almost substantial agreement on it. And we did it fairly quickly. I think it was somewhere about 2 o'clock in the morning that it got to that stage.
Building through the last few weeks was a feeling of actually being comfortable with, and understanding when we're talking over things, right, well, now we understand each other's mind and how we are going to work. And that, I think, as much as anything, is why we were able fairly quickly on that Thursday night to say, looking at the 2 or 3 things that are there, saying yes to that, no to that, yes to that, no to that. And they said, fine, that's okay.
Eventually, they came down at about 2 o'clock in the morning, I think it was. I don't think I'll ever forget it. I unfortunately lost the run of myself and began to jump up and down and say, we're there, we've made it, and embraced a few of my colleagues.
John Hume was left to quietly reflect on the Assembly compromise, which made his power-sharing goal a reality. Unionists had conceded a cabinet-style government, but Nationalists agreed Unionist-controlled committees could keep an eye on what ministers were up to. His dealing done, early on Friday morning, David Trimble left for a nearby hotel. But the lights were still burning in Sinn Féin's offices. The deals on the Assembly and cross-border bodies appeared to outmanoeuvre Republicans, who on this occasion didn't much like being ourselves alone.
Getting meetings with the SDLP was very difficult to do. I think in all of the time that we were there, party to party, I don't think they once asked us for a meeting. If we felt that a meeting was required, it was we who had to do the asking.
Their sense of isolation had been reinforced by a sharp rebuff from the SDLP earlier that evening.
Even as we left the meeting with the first meeting with the Ulster Unionists on that Tuesday night, I was approached by one of the Sinn Féin delegates. Would we have a meeting with them? And I said no. We're engaged with the Unionists. We've been at it for 2 years. You haven't given us a scrap of paper on it. You haven't put a scrap of paper into relation to Strand 1. You haven't seriously addressed it with anybody. It's a little bit late now.
That's totally erroneous. That's not true. We engaged in every single strand. We had a particular position in relation to Strand 1 where we made our position quite clear that we believed that there shouldn't be an assembly, that was a mistake in our opinion. And obviously, it became clear to us that there was going to be an assembly. And whenever that became clear that it was happening, we engaged with Senator Mitchell and with the 2 governments on a without prejudice basis, and we put in all the safeguards that we wanted.
We did make a deal with the British government, the Irish government, the SDLP. We were negotiating with them. And Sinn Féin, as far as we could see, were not significantly involved in talks during that week at all. That was our impression.
At this stage, it was rumoured Sinn Féin were so unhappy they might walk away for good.
Well, I think there were mixed emotions all around the place. I think that undoubtedly different people who were there may have had a view that would have been the sensible thing to do. I actually think there would have been a minority, and our attitude was that we would stay until we would fight our corner.
Have you any idea how long this meeting is going to go on?
This was a 2-year process. This was a process in which anyone who wanted to sabotage it, any of those left at the end, could have done so at an earlier stage. And anyone who wanted to leave had plenty of reasons for leaving at an earlier stage. The fact that they hung in there and stayed there until the end, to me, was conclusive evidence of their determination to get to an agreement.
Instead of walking out, Martin McGuinness and Gerry Adams kept talking. Their mood improved after some hard bargaining during a critical meeting on prisoners with the two Prime Ministers.
There was some talk, you know, that they would come back to 3 years, and we told them that that was unacceptable, that if there was an agreement that prisoners should be out, and we wanted them out right away. But at the same time, we knew that it wasn't going to be as simple as that, that there was going to be a time period. And so we were arguing for the best deal that we could possibly get, and eventually they came down to the 2-year figure.
I think that's where the real damage was done. For example, out of the draft document came the commitment that decommissioning would be an indispensable part of an agreement. That was taken out. Into the document came the commitment that all the terrorist prisoners who were eligible for early release would be released within a 2-year period. That was a new development and was obviously a blatant attempt by the two governments to keep Sinn Féin IRA on board the process.
Our primary focus was on the structures, on the constitutional issues and the structures, which are the meat of the agreement. The other issues, although they've formed a lot of, captured a lot of attention afterwards, the other issues actually are the matters which are consequential on there being peace and there being a genuine end to violence.
In an effort to get an even better deal for their prisoners, Sinn Féin tried to enlist some unlikely allies.
There were 50 members of the Progressive Unionist Party in the building and in our offices when Gerry Kelly came up the corridor and the doors were open and they saw him outside and he was looking for me. And I went out to see, much to some of their, strangeness, if you like. I went out to see what he wanted. And what he wanted was, he wanted us to attempt to screw the government away from the 2-year cut-off date that is now in the agreement down to 1 year. And at worst, he felt that the government would have to compromise with 18 months.
When it appeared that they were, prepared to accept a very lengthy period for the release of prisoners, we thought that that was damaging to the cause of the release of all of the prisoners. And we said so. And of course, we sought out people to put our case to make it clear that we thought that that was a mistake.
And I made it very clear to Sinn Féin that we wouldn't be holding anybody to hostage over the prisoners issue. That we had done as good as we could get. It's as good as it gets for prisoners in this agreement.
While the drama unfolded inside castle buildings, there was a rival attraction at Carson's statue.
We've got here, I asked that you'd get up here as far as the monument. Now, we've done that.
People began to sense that if he was arriving up, he must be convinced something was happening inside. And indeed, something was happening, something very important. We were moving to a deal. And I think the other thing that had an effect was the pictures that were conveyed of his press conference.
Let me say to you tonight. Not one of you can give out a number. Let me.
Ian, where are you taking us? Ian, where are you going to take us?
The Grand Old to New York, Mark 1 and Mark 2.
When it became apparent that loyalists were actually prepared to confront Ian Paisley, it made it very clear that what we were going through was a long way different from 1974.
The live media coverage was attracting huge audiences. It was also drawing more and more party supporters into castle buildings.
It really became a very different kind of place in terms of the sort of people that were there. Indeed, I joked to one of my colleagues that if they'd wanted to introduce internment, all they needed to do was close the doors, because there were so many folk of all sorts of different descriptions up around the talks at that stage that they would have had most of the significant figures in Northern Ireland around, I suspect.
There were no windows in the interior sections of the building. So it was quite amusing often to find out that you'd worked all night not knowing it. And it was only when you went out to get a press interview in the morning that dawn had come up.
You didn't know when you were going to be called upon, so it was an impossibility for one to have a drink and relax. There's times when, gosh, you didn't feel like one. There's times I went up and said, I would just love to be able to sit here and have a drink. But it was always a situation where that was never going to be on.
On the top floor of this political powder keg, two prime ministers were trying to piece together an historic deal.
Blair, I think we had a number of meetings, I forget how many, exactly, but it was well somewhere between 8 and a dozen. He hadn't been to bed, and yet he was a class act. Never had a note, never had a document in front of him, never referred to a civil servant, and was there taking all the arguments on board. Bertie spent quite some time with trade unions negotiating. A different type of negotiator from Blair, but a very, very subtle one.
By lunchtime on Friday, all issues had apparently been resolved. The final document was circulated, and the parties had an hour to review it. David Trimble asked for 2, but that wasn't enough.
We got the paper, came down, split it up into sections, sent off groups of colleagues to look at them, then came back together again and say, right, you know, you've looked at the Strand 1 section, is that okay? Is that what we think it's expected to be? And going round to see what it is, what are the problems.
When I read the document and I saw the significant slippage that there had been on issues like prisoners and decommissioning, it was at that point that I realised that this was an agreement that I could not support on moral grounds.
People were coming in from all arts and parts to other party rooms, congratulating and celebrating. But I don't think they were alert to the fact that there was still a major problem.
We narrowed the problems down to 2, essentially. Prisoners, and it was with respect to that we obtained, or at least sought, more detailed information from government on numbers and the detail of the release scheme, and found that there were some, you know, mitigating factors. The terms of this release scheme, particularly with regard to the licences, are the toughest licence schemes that there have ever been in terms of ensuring that people are liable to be recalled, not just in terms of what they do personally, but in terms of the general situation.
All kinds of rumours were flying around the place that they weren't happy with the decommissioning part of it, and the prisoners part of it, and the policing part of it, and then it became all of it.
The other big problem was the question of whether the mechanism to ensure that people entering the administration were genuinely committed to peaceful means was going to be effective enough. It's then that we go up to see the Prime Minister to lay those concerns in front of him and to argue the matter through there.
I indicated very clearly to the Prime Minister that unless he was prepared to build into the agreement a clear requirement for decommissioning of terrorist weapons as a prerequisite to people holding ministerial office, or indeed the release of prisoners, then I couldn't support the agreement.
We can actually overcome any of the remaining difficulties that there are. But, you know, these are always going to be very tough and very hard negotiations.
The Ulster Unionists came back down to an increasingly fraught gathering in their office. Acutely aware of the potential dangers, Senator Mitchell had already been in contact with the White House.
President Clinton called me, and he asked me whether I thought it would be helpful for him to call some of the party leaders. I told him I thought it would be. We then discussed what you might expect in such a conversation. Who should he call? What would be the most persuasive arguments? What was the status of the negotiation? What were the particular difficulties? What should he stay away from? That sort of thing.
I said, well, Mr. President, let me bring you up to date. We've got a problem. I told him what the problem was, about the need to ensure that people who are not committed to peaceful means were not in the administration. I said, I think there's a solution. I think the Prime Minister is working on that solution. But to get it into place, we need other parties to, give enough space for it to come in. And so I asked him, would he please phone those other parties and see what they could do to enable us to get this solution into place. I believe he did actually make the calls that I suggested to him that he made.
Who did you ask him to ring?
Ah, well, now, there have got to be some things left for the history books.
The President's role in the last days was important. but it is more significant to look at it over a period of several years. Every one of those participants who received a telephone call from the president knew the president, had met with him personally more than once, knew of his interest, knew that he was really motivated by a desire to get this job done. That's the significance of the president's involvement.
There was a lot of pressure at this stage, enormous pressure. The Prime Minister was ringing almost every 15 minutes to see what was happening. Other parties were coming down to our office to find out what was going on. Indeed, at one stage, John Alderdice became very aggressive towards some of our negotiating team.
Some of the Ulster unions were saying, oh, well, I mean, if we have to wait a few days, come back next week or whatever, that's just the way it'll have to be. Now, that was not a possibility. If we broke up that night without having had a plenary and made a decision, this whole thing was going to unstitch. I had no doubt about that. And I had to make that very clear that that was my view. And I felt it was better for someone like me to express very straightly that things had to be dealt with than perhaps for me not to do something and other people to start expressing it in even less constructive ways.
And then I met a senior civil servant of the Irish government, and I said, well, what's the problem? I've met people who are saying it's this, this and this. And he said, I think it's everything. And he said, I think one of the biggest problems that they're now faced with is that there's a dawning realisation that they might have to go into government with you.
The Women's Coalition have been pushing, indeed, they're saying that in the plenary they will raise the issue of a top-up. Is that a non-starter?
A short time later, David Trimble received a letter from the Prime Minister aimed at satisfying his concerns on decommissioning.
I understand there was a letter of comfort offered in relation to the question of decommissioning. I haven't seen that letter of comfort yet. I have no doubt as an historical document it will become available. But then again, the harsh reality of the political process is there's an agreement there. That's what will be implemented.
The Prime Minister's letter underlined his commitment that decommissioning must happen during the setting up of the Assembly and appeared to offer legislation to make it happen.
The Prime Minister's letter comes down, we look at it, and a number of us said, well, not ideal, but we think we can work with this because there will be time to get it right. I said, well, look, we've got to make a decision. And I think it has to be yes, and we'll have to go up now. And it's at that point, well, some of the colleagues were saying that they didn't think it was really quite good enough, and at the time when you have to take a deep breath and decide.
I indicated to the party leader at that stage that because of these key issues, issues which for me were a matter of conscience, a matter of whether you blur the lines between terrorism and democracy, lines which I was not prepared to see blurred. And I told the party leader that I couldn't support the agreement as it was presently constructed, and that therefore that if he was proceeding with the agreement that I would have to withdraw my support for it.
Outside the Ulster Unionist delegation room, the other parties were trying to find out if there was ever going to be a deal.
We thought that we're going to go through this again and again and again. But what made me so certain that there would be an agreement was that George Mitchell had his flight booked for the next morning, and he had told me personally, because I had a good relationship with him, he says, Hugh, come with me, I intend to be on that plane. No, it wasn't a threat, it was a reality, it was a fact of life that George was going on that plane the next day.
By late in the afternoon, around about 4:30, we were absolutely at make or break. Indeed, I remember my wife phoned me at that stage, and she had expected by lunchtime that we would be coming out with the thing. And I said, I don't know, love, it could all go to pieces in the next 5 minutes.
The last one to contact me was David Trimble for the Ulster Unionist Party, and at 4:45 on Friday afternoon, he called me. He said, we're ready to proceed to plenary. I said to him, David, I think that we ought to do it promptly, and my intention, unless you disagree, is to call a meeting for 5 o'clock, just 15 minutes from now. He said, no, that's fine with me, let's go ahead. Never have I felt a sense of gratification and responsibility and gratitude that I feel today.
The last few hours had been a severe test of David Trimble's leadership, and as he led his team into the final plenary session, one of his most senior party colleagues was no longer at his side.
Jeffrey had said that he didn't want to go up to the plenary, that he wasn't comfortable with the position that we're at, and consequently he didn't want to go up to the plenary. And I said, fine, didn't see any reason to push the matter.
David Trimble was in the white heat of pressure. And when he came into the final signing up, there were noticeable absences from his lineup. And when the formalities were being gone through and each party leader was addressed, do you support or not support? He paused for a moment and then just said, yes. So Ulster had said yes.
These political leaders have been in a very tough spot with lives at stake, including their own. And yet, at the crucial time, they rose to the occasion and they made honorable, principled compromise.
It reminded me of pictures and film footage that one has seen of things like the Treaty of Versailles and so on. That, my goodness, this wasn't just we who knew each other and came from Northern Ireland and had fought the bit out politically and so on. It wasn't just, this was actually something much bigger than any of us or even all of us.
I said that it would be to our eternal shame and that we personally would hang our heads in shame if we could not make this thing work. So it was great to hold your head up and to walk out and feel a sense of solidarity. It was a tremendous sense of solidarity with other parties.
You knew you were walking out of the most unique thing that has happened in Northern Irish political life, and that is a formal decision by unionism and nationalism that it was going to work. Each was going to work together with the other to solve our problems.
Jonathan Powell, a lot of experience in the Foreign Office before he became the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, so a lot of experience of complex negotiations, said to me afterwards that because of the number of parties and the range and the complexity of the issues involved, that it was the most difficult negotiation that he had ever experienced. I certainly don't want to experience another one like it.
I told the participants in the talks that my next goal is to come back when the assembly is in operation, to sit in the gallery with my son and to watch them argue over education and housing and the problems of daily life in Northern Ireland in a way that democratic legislators discuss everywhere. Then I would really feel fulfilled and satisfied.